Us today is John Culpepper and Katie Culpepper. We are Compost for Good. John will talk a little bit more about who we are and what we do. But the reason for this presentation is we provide a lot of technical assistance to a broad range of community scale compost presences in the North Country. One of them is compost operators. And within that group, we have a pretty strong focus on farmers in the North Country. So a lot of the farmers are signed up to get this presentation in a recorded format because they're out in the fields farming. But we realized through a fair amount of our support that we were offering that there were some foundational gaps, let's say, in basic compost knowledge. So we decided to put this presentation together to kind of bring the level of collective knowledge up so that we can continue to move forward in the way that we offer assistance as we progress. So I'm going to screen share the presentation. Because we are such a small and intimate group, please chime in at any point if you would like. You can interrupt us as we're talking. You can throw something into the chat, do the raise hand feature, anything like that. We would strongly always prefer a more circular roundtable format than us just kind of talking at you. That being said, and for folks out there listening to this recording, it is information dense. Composting can be extraordinarily simple. It can also be something that is a lifelong pursuit of knowledge and fine tuning. Christine is joining us from the DEC. That's exciting. So chime in with questions. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to John Culpepper, who's going to start, and then I will finish up the presentation at the end.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks for everyone who is joining us today. We are Compost for Good. Jen, just follow my lead and click when you're ready. And this is our vision. I'm not going to read it to you, but we try to be, we really try to provide resources to anyone in the space in which we are mostly working, and that is from the backyard composter to the large industrial commercial scale. So that range between the backyard composter and the large industrial scale, we realized that there was a lot of information that people wanted, and we stepped in to fill that space. Thank you. And we are three people. You see us on the screen, and there we are on the rock. We are a project of ADK Action, that, for those of you who don't know, is a not-for-profit powerhouse in the Adirondacks. And we're also associated, a partner of the Adirondack North Country Association. And we're delighted to be working with both of them. And let me just say, while we focus primarily on New York State, we work with folks from all over the country, and in fact, folks from all over the world. In fact, this week I had conversations with at least 3 people from outside of the United States. So I'll start with sort of a basic question: why make compost? Lots of reasons, but I'll give you a few here. It's all about taking unstable organic material and making it stable. When you do that, and when you do that well, you can create organic compounds that are what we call, well, I just forgot the name. Well, anyway, that last or persist in the soil for decades, if not hundreds of years. So this is a way to stabilize organic compounds so that they can do good work in the soil. Most importantly, well-made compost builds soil in lots of different ways, and primarily through fostering microbial communities underground. As I look out my window, I see a lot of above ground trees and shrubs and grass. Let me assure you that if you dig underground and were to weigh the biomass of all that material underground, a lot more biomass under the ground than what you see in front of you, even in the densest of woods. And so not only biomass is more underground, but the variety, numbers of species are many, many, many more. Okay. Oh, soil, when done well, soil enriched with compost can actually sequester compost for a long time. So we talk a lot about climate mitigation strategies, and we often don't think about composting as a really powerful climate mitigation strategy. Let me assure you that the world's largest carbon sink is the Earth's oceans, but right behind that is the world's soils. And if done well, you can take a 1,000-acre farm and within a year, year and a half, turn that farm from a carbon emitter to a carbon sink. It's really quite remarkable. Thank you. Not all compost is the same. And this is important to know if you're purchasing compost, and if you're making compost, we encourage you to make the highest value compost that you can, for lots of reasons that we'll get into. And a lot of people have this misconception that they can pick up a handful of, in fact, I had this misconception just a couple of years ago that I could differentiate between really good compost and bad, so to speak, compost. You can't do it by eye, and you can't do it by smell. You really have to look at the microbial life in that soil. We work with farmers and compost operators who have been doing this for a long time, and they think they're producing really high value compost. And all compost, almost all compost is of value. There's no question about that. But to get to the highest value compost, you have to know what you're doing. And the most common method by which farmers or consultants use to determine the health of their soil or the health of their compost is through physical analyses. And while those physical analyses are important and valuable, they don't tell you the whole story. Put that sample under a microscope and you get the whole story. We're going to talk a little bit about composting machinery later in the presentation, but this is one that Jen and her partner built. That's Jen and myself doing a high five in front of the one that they built. This is a monster, 5 foot in diameter, 20 feet long, and it will take up to and more than a ton or 2 tons, Jen?
2 comfortably. We're knocking on 3
per week.
Yeah.
Wow, it's amazing. And our role in this process is really to steward the little guys who do the work for us. That's the microbes, the microbial communities. And to really make them comfortable, we optimize the environmental conditions in which they thrive and which they reproduce. And then we take those microbes and we transfer them to soils, either through the direct application of compost or extracting those microbes out of the compost and then using that in a liquid spray on the soils. So let me give you a sense of the power of microbes and why we can reach high temperatures, and just a little bit about how incredible these things are. If one were to, and a number of research groups have done this, if you try to calculate the number of grains of sand on planet Earth, and there are ways to do that and get fairly close within an order of magnitude or 2, you'd come up with a number that is quite large. Next, Jen. That's the number within an order of magnitude or 2 of the number of grains of sand on the Earth. In a composter like I just showed you, that Jen and John built, there are at very least twice as many, next Jen, twice as many microbes in that drum as there are grains of sand on planet Earth. Each one of those, next please, each one of those little microbes is metabolizing food for themselves. And just like us, each one produces a little bit of thermal energy, a little bit of heat. When you have this many in a confined environment, then you can get up to 140, 150, 160 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. That's how it's done. Next. Okay, so we're gonna sort of look at the cast of characters here quickly. The characters who do all the work. So all of these slides are from images that I have taken from folks around, samples from around the North Country area. So a lot going on in this slide, but just focus inside of the red circles. All of those little dots that you see are bacteria. And if this were a live shot, then those bacteria will appear to be humming in the background. There are up to 75,000 different species of bacteria in a gram of soil. Not numbers, but species. Next, please. The circle now is on really the star of our show if we're talking about climate carbon sequestration, and that's fungal communities. This is a fungal mycelia within the red circle. Next, please. And these are fungal spores that I've circled. In fact, there are at least 3 more that I didn't circle. And if you look at the top circle, you see how that spore is actually germinating. You see a mycelia that is growing out of that spore. So in well-made compost, you should see a lot of fungi and a lot of fungal spores. Next, please. Most of us know nematodes as a bad thing. Let me assure you that beneficial nematodes are something that you want in your compost and in your soil. And this is what they look like. And they're especially fun to watch under live microscope. Next, please. Protozoa is the next character in this cast of characters. There's a lot of different kinds of bacteria, a lot of different kinds of fungi, and a lot of different kinds of protozoa. Here I've circled 2. There may be more in there. These are testate amoebas. Next, please. And I want to talk briefly about one of the benefits that these microbes have for your soil. When you have adequate numbers of bacteria and fungi, they create micro or macro aggregation. We call this soil organic matter aggregation. Next, please. Actually, let's go back to the last one. Sorry about that. Yep. So if you take a look at the blob in the center there, that blob consists of organic material, bacteria, fungi, mineral material. These bacteria and fungi are literally consuming both the mineral content within your soil and the organic content, and they're also consuming each other. But in the process of living and growing, they are producing sticky materials, polysaccharides that glue things together. And when you glue a lot of these things, and we have a lot of these aggregates in the soil, incredible things happen. Next, please. So this occurs, next, please. Next, please. Soil organic matter, and next, please. What happens when you have a lot of macro aggregation is you get an increase in water holding capacity. It is quite remarkable what a little increase in organic material, specifically aggregated organic material, can do for water holding capacity. It also increases water percolation rates. Next, please. And that is the rate at which water moves through the soil during storm events. and that can reduce or eliminate nutrient and sediment runoff. You also increase or improve soil tilth. Next, please. This is the physical structure of soil. And for those of you who've worked the soil a lot, you can put your hands into really, really good soil and you can just feel it. It's got this structure that poor soils don't have. So with good biology and with good soil organic matter aggregation, you can improve soil tilth, which increases rooting depth. So most of us think in terms of 4 to 6 inches in cropping systems. There's no reason why, the reason why we think that is oftentimes we're working in soils where there's a hard pan of material down at some point, be it 4 inches, 6 inches, 8 inches, whatever. If you have the adequate biology in the soil, you can break that up and create soils that are 12 inches deep, 24 inches deep, 10 feet deep, 30 feet deep. If you go to the Midwest, before we destroyed so many of those soils in high grass prairies, you can find easily soil plant roots, grass, prairie grass roots down 30 feet and more. You also improve what's called the cation exchange capacity. That's the ability for soils to hold on to cations, calcium, magnesium, things like that, plant nutrients. You also increase food and shelter for the beneficial soil microbes. So once you start this process, and if you can maintain this process, then it's self-perpetuating. You create more spaces for these microbes that produces more microbes, on and on and on. Next, please. And ultimately, what we're getting at is greater farm productivity by reducing your inputs. Next, please. So how do we increase the optimize the environmental conditions for these little guys? You have to have the right moisture content, be around 50%. Next, please. And you can test this with a moisture meter or pick up a handful of soil and squeeze it hard. If you can pull out a drop or two of liquid, then that you're at about 50-55%, whether that's compost or soil. And to prevent excess moisture and heat loss, this is best done under some type of cover. It doesn't have to be expensive. It can be nothing more than a compost tarp, a breathable tarp, but preferably under some sort of cover. Next, please. If material in your composting process gets too wet, it will begin to smell funky, and that's a sure sign that you've got anaerobic microbes growing. So what happens is you start reducing the air pockets within the compost or the soil, and those aerobic bacteria, fungi, protozoa, microarthropods, all those things can't really produce. And so therefore, anaerobes begin to proliferate. You've got to have the right CNN ratio, that's carbon to nitrogen ratio. And in the composting process, we want it somewhere around 30-1. Now, none of us get too hung up over this. It can be a wide range. You don't have to nail it at 30-1. This material wants to decompose, but to do it in the most efficacious way, in the most efficient way, you want to dial in all the physical parameters. Next, please. And once you're finished, that compost should be somewhere in the range of a 10-1 carbon to nitrogen. And you have to have it oxygenated. In other words, again, if it's too wet or if it's too dense, anaerobes will proliferate, and you can provide that oxygen through a variety of mechanisms, physically turning it, physically fluffing it, pumping air into the system, lots of different ways to do that. Next, please. What is organic material? And this seems kind of fundamental, but we find that it's not. Organic material is anything that was once alive. Next. Anything that contains carbon atoms. Next, please. And some material is harder to break down than others. Those of you who are working or have worked with food scraps for a long time, you know that this is some of the more difficult material to turn into high value compost because of its high variability in terms of feedstock material, moisture content, and so forth. Next, please. Many of us develop our recipes by feel, but it is really best to do this or to check your feel through some sort of a more systemized process. So in the class of high nitrogen materials, that includes grass, food scraps, fresh yard debris, slaughterhouse offal, animal mortalities, and even human remains. I am proud to live in the 6th state in the United States in which composting of human remains is now legal. It's not being done, and it probably won't be done for several years. It will take that long to sort out the regulatory details. Chicken manure, most people know that, horse manure, carbon. So what are the carbon feedstocks? Wood chips, compressed wood pellets. Now, why would you use an expensive wood pellet? You do that, or I do that to demonstrate how it can be automated. The whole process can be more automated because you can auger those compressed wood pellets into your composting process, and it produces a really fine textured compost, beautiful compost.
Knut just raised his hand, so Knut, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I got a quick question. What's the
Sure.
difference between fresh yard debris and
Yeah,
wood
good question.
wood chips?
Yeah, so if it's green leaves and small branches that are still pliable, that would have a high carbon content. If it's really dry yard waste, wood chips that are dry, even grass clippings that are really dried down, then that the nitrogen has flashed off, and what you're left with is mostly carbon or yuck in the case of
Okay, so fresh kind of
yeah,
grass and okay.
exactly, yeah.
Thank you.
In an ideal world, you add your carbon dry. You dry it down before you add it to your composting process. That's not always possible, and that's not mandatory by any means. But if you use dry carbon, you're able to dial in your recipe a little more carefully. Your carbon feedstock in some systems provide more ability to create air spaces, more aeration. You don't always have to have wood chips to do this. In a rotating vessel type system or an aerated static pile, you can get away with finer material like sawdust. Sawdust is a little tricky in aerated static piles because it can be too dense, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, next. Yeah, and depending upon the final use of the compost, you may have an additional process of screening out what we call the overs, or the large bits, and those large bits can go right back into the composting process to be broken down. Soiled paper with caution. I wouldn't encourage anyone doing small scale composting to use too much soiled paper, but it can be done quite effectively in larger systems. Next, please.
I have another question. What about coffee grinds?
Oh, coffee grounds are great. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
But not too much, or?
It all is about recipe development. So you can compost nothing but coffee grounds with some added carbon and added, but you have to get your moisture content correct. But yes, coffee grounds are great to add to composting systems or compost all on their own. We have experimented extensively with diverted human urine. Let me assure you that there are researchers all over the world trying to figure out how to extract plant nutrients from human urine. Turns out that most of the plant nutrients that we excrete are in the form of urine. Urine is very convenient to divert, to collect, transport, and to compost. We've processed well over 700 gallons of diverted human urine, making it into a beautiful compost, biologically complete, smells great, looks better than you can buy in just about anywhere. Next, please.
I shouldn't go to the bathroom in a compost pile, or I should?
You have to be a little careful with human urine because there's a yuck factor, but it's certainly perfectly fine to add it to your existing compost pile as long as your compost pile can accommodate it. Well, in other words, you don't want the compost pile to be too wet, but you can compost nothing. You can compost nothing but diverted human urine, a carbon source, and added water for additional moisture content, and that will produce a beautiful, beautiful compost. Okay, Jen, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, John. So this is probably a really good chance. Knut's been weighing in with questions. Does anybody have questions for John? Anybody, it doesn't have to just be a question. It can also be, do you have a story, something that you had an experience with that you'd like to share? We'd love to hear it.
Jen, there's one that just came in the chat from Tanisha.
Hey.
If you want, you can unmute and share yourself, or I can read it.
Yeah, I was just asking, is human urine being used as just moisture in addition to already having an established compost pile, or is it a nitrogen source?
It's a good source of nitrogen and phosphorus, but it also brings in water content as well. So it does both.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions from anybody else?
And by the way, we're the only group in the world that I'm aware of that has actually thought to process diverted human urine through a high temperature composting regimen. Most researchers out there are trying to figure out how to extract those nutrients, put it in a form that farmers recognize, a pelletized dry form. But we thought one day, wow, couldn't we just compost it without going through the expensive process of trying to extract those nutrients? Turns out you can, and it's very, very simple and very safe and very effective.
Excellent. Other questions? Okay, some folks joined us partway through. If you would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be fantastic. And as we shared in the very beginning, that we are we're always encouraging interaction. So even if I'm in the middle of a sentence and you want to interrupt with a question or a clarification or a story, we welcome and encourage that. So I'm gonna take over now, and a lot of what I'm going to offer for the second half is reinforcing and expanding on what John just shared. But I want to mention a couple of things. If you are as fascinated by the microscopy element as we all are, we do have a presentation that was just on microscopy. So we were able to get in a bit more depth, and then there's some animated videos that John was talking about, including a nematode eating a fungal body, which is fascinating to watch. So we do have that available. And so the way that we're hoping to structure this presentation is that composting is an art, in my opinion, and we can have all of this elemental and foundational information and knowledge, but really at the end of the day, you do develop a feel for things. But what we're hoping that everybody gets out of this is kind of a systematic way to think about things. So as long as we're aware of the highest level elements, the moisture, the nitrogen carbon ratios, the aeration, then as long as you understand what we need to do to steward these microbes, then from there, it's a lot easier to make decisions, and nothing is ever dialed in or consistent. It can be consistent for a month and then something changes. So I do want to just start with this one slide quickly, just because it's something in compost land that is very actively being discussed, and some of you here might be familiar with it, but the concept of forever chemicals are finding their way into compost systems in some situations through a variety of methods and vectors. So one of them being compostable products, which was very alarming for me as a compost operator to realize something that you think is a great solution actually ended up being not so. So that's one place that they come through. Also wastewater treatment facilities, because you might be composting the biosolids, but within those biosolids is the wastewater from people that are shampooing and flushing pills and things like that. So it's just, I'm just putting this out there as something as an awareness. There's a huge debate going on right now about who is then liable for the presence of those chemicals, with there being some effort through the EPA to have the culpability go to the compost operators, which, as you can imagine, is not sitting very well. I do know we were joined by Christine from the DEC. So toward the end of the presentation, Christine, I'd love to have you introduce yourself, and especially as we talk about the permitting and registration. So just putting you on the spot for that. Great. Okay, so I'm going to move forward. Building on a lot of what John talked about. So recipe development is at the core. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're the backyard composter or you're an industrial composter, developing your recipe is super critical. There are a number of tools above and beyond what John talked about. So the first most basic tool is understanding your feedstocks. What are the characteristics of your feedstocks? Based on the outline that John shared with you, what's the CN ratio, what's the moisture content? There's key elements of your feedstock that are necessary to promote excellent microbial activity. So one of the, John shared one, which is the Penn State, which is a lab test, which is an example. This, I don't think this is actually from Penn State, but this is a sample of oh no, I'm sorry, that's something else. We do have the lab results later. So what is on the lower left is an example of different feedstocks. So every feedstock has characteristics. The question of coffee came up, and I think, is coffee pretty neutral? Where does coffee fall on the CN spectrum?
It's, yeah, neutral.
Neutral,
or like
but
the right ratio.
it's
the
already
right-
got the right ratio.
Yes.
Okay, cool, excellent. So here's some other examples: horse manure without bedding, wood pellets. Those are some examples. We're going to talk later about the guru of community scale composting, James McSweeney, and he actually includes yellow phone books, which I don't understand why that's in there, but that's in there. So every feedstock has characteristics, and if you have a feedstock that you are not able to look up a standard value for, then you can also send your feedstocks away to a lab. So for example, we're using straw, and we knew generally what it was, but by the standards, but we wanted to be sure. So we sent it to a lab, and they came back with results for us, which were basically what they were in line with what we would find in a standard feedstock analysis. So if this conversation about recipe development is making your eyes cross, that's totally natural and totally normal. We were just talking about this earlier today. That's why we're hoping to bring to the table some foundational information, so that if you are ready to take the next step to really dial in on your recipe, when you get something like what we see in the upper right-hand corner, which is a technical recipe calculator, there are a few versions of this that have been created that we would be happy to share with you. It can be a little daunting when you first look at it, but once you start becoming familiar with the way that it works and some of the language, like the carbon nitrogen ratios, hopefully now we understand what that is, it's a little bit easier to work with this tool. And it really is an invaluable tool. For my business, we used it to get started. And then we just, like John said, we just developed a feel for the recipe based on the way our compost pile talks to us. It tells us what it needs. So we've been able to adapt that way. So at this level, what I can share then is that every feedstock has characteristics. You have to factor in those characteristics to your final recipe, that whatever those characteristics are will then impact the ratio by volume that you put in. By that, I mean like a gallon of food scraps per half a gallon of straw, something like that. And that the recipe calculator in this upper right-hand side, it can be an incredible tool to help you get to that final decision-making process. And what will happen is, as you start entering in values, then you click calculator, it will sometimes just automatically calculate on its own down here in this ideal range, reasonable range for the 3 most important factors: carbon, nitrogen, moisture content, bulk density. You're going to start getting, they'll tell you that, okay, you're within the ideal range, and then you can make adjustments. So you can say, oh, I'm too dense, which means you're not going to have enough aeration. Then you might want to add a little bit more carbon. So you can add a little more carbon, see what that does, and then go back and forth until you end up with the ideal range. Again, I recognize, especially if you've never done this before, this can be overwhelming, but if you can take it in baby steps, and it's something in the future that we probably will offer additional trainings to get you there. So again, these are just general guidelines. Observation is the most important for sure. We followed our recipe to a T, but it wasn't quite right because we had too much drainage. And so we have a drum composter. So we realized we needed to be a little bit different.
And Jen, I'm just going to share in the chat that the resource we were talking about earlier today that kind of walks you through the beginning stages of developing a recipe and then how you would use the calculator if you're hoping to do that. So this is a resource through the Vermont DEC and is very helpful if you're interested in kind of getting into this world.
Perfect. Perfect, perfect. Okay, so organic decomposition, there are 3 primary types. Aerobic is what we, with composting, we want to see. And as you can see in the title, aerobic means that there's oxygen and that there's certain microbes and fungi that thrive under aerobic conditions. And those are that's the microbiome that we're looking to reinforce. Anaerobic is what happens, sadly, if food scraps are sent to a landfill and the absence of oxygen, they start to decompose. And that's when things like methane can get generated. And this is one of the primary reasons, among many others, that we want to be composting and diverting food scraps. And it's a different set of microbes in that anaerobic environment. And the third way is through worms or insects. So again, for us, we're into the aerobic process. So in an aerobic decomposition process, there's basically 2 levels of when it's actually actively decomposing. We have the primary decomposition phase and then the secondary phase. In the primary phase, we call this thermophilic, and that involves bacteria that love heat, which is why in that initial primary phase is when you hopefully, if you're doing everything right, if you're an excellent steward, you're going to see your temperatures hopefully at least over 131, but not above 155 to 160. So that that whole process can take, depending on what system you're using. In the drum composter, it can take anywhere from 14 to 28 days. A lot of ASP piles can happen that quickly. Some people who are pre-mixing their food scraps, maybe they're blending them down into very, very fine particles, can go through primary, they're saying, what did they say, Ben Wan's, like a day? It's crazy fast.
Yeah, several days, yeah.
Several days.
But we have yet to see that, so. Yeah,
we want proof. But for sure, breaking down your food scraps to begin with, as long as you still have air pockets, can speed up that entire process. Secondary decomposition is when the thermophiles have done their job and they've broken down the simple sugars and proteins, and then we transition into another series of organisms that become more dominant in this phase. We also will see our temperatures drop. So that's when we know that we're going into that secondary phase, in theory at least. So we're gonna, everything we're talking, we're gonna just layer upon it and take it a little bit deeper each time we go. And again, please chime in with questions if you have them as we go along, or stories that you want to share. So this magic number 131, there's James McSweeney offers a course. It's called the 131 Community Composter course. So that there's a lot of important things that happen once you get above that temperature. The most important thing is that you are pasteurizing. If you do have pathogenic bacteria in there, you're pasteurizing. You also are, there's evidence that there's a pretty good range of either pharmaceuticals or pesticides that get neutralized at certain temperatures and through this entire process. Not all of them for sure, but a good number of them. And under the DEC standards, you need to see 131 degrees for at least 3 days, depending again on your technology, your composting technology. But that's a really important number to reach. You don't want to go above 155 though, for a whole nother series of reasons. So this is when bacteria and fungi are breaking down the organic matter and some of the mineral matter. And the magic of this is that they are excreting enzymes that facilitate the decomposition, which then the other elements are freed up. But also what's happening during this phase is they're basically feeding on each other. It's this very complex food web where they all are using each other. All of the microorganisms are using each other to sustain and thrive in that element. So that happens 18 to 30 days, 131 degrees. You don't want to go over 155 or 160. And then temperatures will start to drop. And we're going to talk about using a thermometer in a little bit and how important that is. And then we head into secondary decomposition. This can happen for a lot longer. This does take a lot longer to get through. But it's important to note that when you go through primary decomposition, if you guys saw the picture of the compost at the end of the drum composter a few slides ago, it looks like compost. It smells like compost. So it's easy to think, oh, we're done. This is beautiful. But what will happen is if you take that pile and you build it, it will cook again. It will reheat. And so now we're into a whole different level of microbial activity. And as John likes to say, this is where the magic happens. So we've got the thermophiles in that hot composting primary. And then when we get into secondary, we have a different set of elements that come in. This is where the protozoa, the nematodes, the microarthropods, which when I first saw a picture of one of them in my compost pile, I thought they were like an alien invasion. It's really cool to see. And and others are consuming some of the bacteria and fungal themselves, producing plant available nutrients, which is, we're not going to get too far into that. If you want to learn more about that, the microscopy workshop really digs into that. But the way that these microorganisms communicate with plant roots by enzymes and different chemical communication is fascinating. It's fascinating. Micro and macro aggregation happens. This is what John spoke about earlier, and we saw some great pictures. This can take a couple to several months to happen. I'm waiting for a beautiful pile. It's fully sold. Somebody's waiting for a compost to go through secondary decomposition, and it's just not cooling down. So it can certainly take a long period of time, but we also don't want to rush that phase because again, that's when the magic happens. If you get too hot, you can produce bacteria, actino. Can you say that for me, John?
Actinobacteria. Yeah.
Which could you maybe speak just for a second about what happens when we're too hot and we produce the white pockets?
Yeah, a couple things can happen. You can actually catch a large pile on fire. That's not common, but if you have a really large composting operation, that can happen. Actinobacteria it's a sign that you're going anaerobic. And the other thing that happens when you hit those really high temperatures is you begin to kill off lots and lots, or they'll go into hibernation, but you start reducing the variability of your microbial populations. And that's not what we want. Just like we don't really want a lot of monocropping happening on top of the ground, we don't want a lot of situations where we're dramatically, significantly reducing the varieties of microbial life.
Perfect. So we're going to do a brief overview of the different technologies that are available. This is just a small snapshot, and it's just a very high level introduction. For sure, there will be future opportunities where we dig into a lot more detail of these systems. But one important differentiation to note is that there's a concept of batch versus continuous flow. Batch is where you have, it's bound in space and time. So it might be a bin and you load that bin and it doesn't leave the bin and it stops at a certain period of time. Continuous flow can happen with the drum composter where the feedstock is coming in every day. We feed our drum composter every day. Some of it comes out the other end. So it's a continuum. It's also important to note that different systems can be used at different phases of the process. So you might, like for our system, we have the drum composter, and then it goes out into a bin and bay system for secondary curing. Also, it needs to fit your needs. You maybe have a really super small footprint and not a lot of money. Maybe you have a grant so you can buy a composter. It really, there's a lot of factors that go into what system you choose to do. So bin and bay, here's Katie Culpepper wielding a hammer, somewhat scarily, but so this is a backyard bin and bay system that Katie created. This is what we see a lot in backyard applications. What's great about this is that you can do 3 different systems. So one can be cooking in the curing phase, another can be in the secondary phase, one can be the newly fed bin. So, and it also can be made to be quite large. Our friends at Blue Line Compost, they have very 10 by 10 large bin and bay system. They use a tractor. And what they do is they dump from one bin to a curing pile, and then they just move from bin to bin to bin. And they're able then also to know this pile, this batch went 131 for 3 days, and we know it. Boom, it gets spun and mixed. This pile, this situation went 131 degrees for 3 days. So it does help you monitor your process. It also, you can do this with an ASP system, which we're going to talk about what that means in a little bit. I will share from personal experience, if you're going to use a tractor to push against the back of your bin, you need to have something reinforcing the back. This is a system that y'all built at North Country School, right, John and Katie? So an example of a really aesthetically appealing and beautiful system. Windrow systems are what we see most commonly. There's lots of ways to build a windrow system, but you want to make sure that your piles are of a certain height. You don't want to make them long and skinny because you really do need the height, but you also don't want them to be too tall, you know, way over your head if you don't have the equipment to handle them. You can use a tractor with a bucket where you go into the side and pick up some pile and dump it and move down. They also, we'll talk about windrow turners in a couple of minutes. They make something that you don't have to have the space next to the pile. Also from experience, I can say it's really important if you have a tractor to be careful not to scrape the ground, because you can bring in sand and rocks into an otherwise beautiful pile of compost. This is a video, we'll just show it as a picture. So this is an industrial scale windrow turner. You see a guy standing up there on his deck. My partner and I have something that's in between this and a really small windrow turner that goes on the side of a tractor. And it's basically like a big rototiller. So it goes over the pile and it mixes as it goes. The more advanced windrow turners actually can infuse water as they're going if you are needing to control your moisture. So you can have your windrow turner, and as it's going down your pile, water comes into your pile to maintain that moisture content. Windrows can also be really helpful if you're doing animal mortalities. We had an animal mortality workshop. This is Jean Bontel, and we are at Reber Rock Farm there using wood chips. So if anybody wants to talk about animal mortality composting, we'd be more than happy to do that. ASP is aerated static pile is another opportunity. So again, there's a lot of information here, but as long as we can always just be thinking, okay, what do we need? We need to maintain our carbon nitrogen, so your feedstock. We need to be maintaining aeration, and we need to be concerned about moisture content. And we also need to be concerned about structure. So if it's too dense, you're not going to get the air that you need. So that pile structure, the characteristics of the structure are really important as well. So ASP is super simple. It's thinking about the aeration. If we put pipes in the bottom, then these pipes are perforated with the holes at an angle facing down so they don't get clogged with the material. And you can either passively or actively aerate your pile as long as you've got big enough. You can see the big chunks of wood here. Those are providing channels of air. So it creates an airflow situation in your pile. It does require, over here, we see that's where the pumps are stored. There's electricity needed. This pump is in a waterproof container. We built one literally using cardboard, duct tape, and plastic bags. We went to Lowe's and bought some piping and some elbows, and we're very, very happy with how it's performing. And we just keep building on it as our pile grows. So it's a pretty simple thing to get into. It's can also be extremely complex and technical if you want to take it to that level. This is the great thing about ASP as well, is that you can capture heat in that setting, or you can also maybe capture nutrients. We are supporting a farmer who is practicing that. Another possible downfall for ASP is that you do have to manage your pipes. If you've got a tractor, you just have to be really skilled or lucky with your tractor operations to make sure you don't damage those pipes.
In this particular system, I'll just note that the pipes get disconnected from the manifold and are pulled out with a tractor. So when that pile is cooked, you can pull those pipes because they can handle that, and then put the pipes in another location and start a new pile on top of those pipes.
Excellent. And we will have the June 12th workshop is about ASP specifically at the Witten family farm. So lots more detail with that one. Are there any questions before we continue? Okay, great. John, did you want to quickly talk about the Johnson series?
Yeah, happy to do that. This is David Johnson on the right, his wife. He and David and his wife came up with this idea of how to produce fungally dominant compost using a very, very simple system. This is nothing but wood chips that are kept hydrated, and it takes about 9 months, 12 months to produce the finished compost. So it's a slow process, but what you end up with is compost that is extraordinarily good for perennial crops and also for pasture systems because it has a high fungal biomass in that compost.
Thank you. Perfect. This is a picture of the drum composter that John Culpepper. This is how I met John. When I was working at Inca, we were able to help John fund the construction of this system. The design is available in open source. We have supported multiple entities to build their own, including an individual that we just realized in the Netherlands has created an entire company around this model. We have folks manufacturing them in the North Country. It is 4 feet by 20 feet. We have extensive resources if you're interested in the composter, if you want to build it, if you want to possibly be gifted one through grant funding, please reach out to us and we're happy to support that for you. In-vessel composting has a huge number of benefits to it. It optimizes the environmental conditions. So this is where you can control if it's raining or if it's cold, especially in the wintertime, you're able to just continue because you've containerized the system. It can speed up the process rapidly. Requires a very small footprint, basically, because you just have to be able to put things in, and the mixing, the aeration happens in the drum. It reduces flies, smells, vermin, or it containerizes the smell too. When you rotate it, there's still a little bit of an odor, but that quickly dissipates. And this is important to know because a lot of people think, oh, okay, I can't do meat scraps, I can't do dairy scraps, but the drum composter allows you to process pretty much everything, including sometimes weird things like boots and other strange things that find themselves in the composting system. So yeah, it really is. The downside to it is it's not cheap. Even if you build your own, it's still buy-in for a 15 or for a 4-footer or even a 5-footer is around $17,000 in material costs, plus then you still need to build it. But we believe that those costs can be recouped, especially if you have some way to offset it by grants. And I'm going to punt back to you for the neighborhood scale because this is definitely your baby.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So we're really all about finding the least expensive way to process, to turn organic matter, organic materials into high value compost. So this is one that is still somewhat experimental. This is a 4-foot diameter culvert, can be 3-foot diameter by 4 feet tall. And if built well, the temperature inside these drums can get to 150 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, and can process everything out of a medium-sized neighborhood. They can also be coupled to create, if you're an entrepreneur who wants to get into commercial composting, but can't afford the upfront costs of a large system, then you can get into this using multiple. And I think the next slide shows that, Jen. The next slide.
Yeah,
Jen.
it's not, it's,
Oh, you're stuck.
I'm unstucking now. There-
Oh, there we go.
Yep.
So imagine setting, I think in this case, there are 10 of these composters, each one that can hold somewhere around 1,800 pounds of material. And imagine you've got a number of them, and you can pick up the drums once the primary decomposition happens with a tractor with forks or some sort of simple system, and then bucket that material into a secondary decomposition pile. And you can be into small commercial scale fairly quickly and for very little money. And you can scale these systems up. Now, it's not necessarily ideal to have 50 of these that you have to manage, but it is a way to go from a small scale up to a larger scale inexpensively.
Okay. Vermicomposting, a lot of us, Sarah, yes, hand is raised. How about it?
If you go back one slide,
Yep.
I just wanted clarification. It says approximately 1 ton of finished compost every 30 days. So that includes the primary and secondary stage?
Sarah, it's a good question. I don't remember how I determined these numbers. I've slept since then, and every time I sleep, it's like a giant eraser on a
I just wanted, because earlier Jen was saying about how it's like 2 to 3 months for that secondary, and you were saying like your pile still cooling off. I didn't.
I'm so sorry. This would be primary decomposition. So
Okay.
in order to get to 1 ton of finished compost every 30 days. So if you aerated this, and we're working on a system where air is pumped into these drums, then potentially you could get to very immature compost within 30 days. But I should amend that. For most cases, it would take more than 30 days. Good catch, Sarah. Appreciate that.
Okay, thank you.
And that's something to note too, that Katie and John, what's is it like 2/3? Like your original pile size will be radically smaller than what you started with. Is it 2/3 reduction?
Well, either mass or
volume?
volume, you'll
By
reduce
volume.
by 50% or maybe up to 60%. So you'll end up with either 50% of what you started out with, or as little as 40%. So a lot of volume, a lot of mass is lost in the process.
Awesome.
And that's the case for any composting, not just for this type.
Yes.
Great.
Any kind of decomposition for that matter.
Including our decomposition. So vermicompost is not something that Compost for Good does too much with. People that do it love it, and it's its own thing. Arguably, we could spend an entire week on vermicompost in terms of what's out there and available, but in the most highest level for us to be aware of is that it is somewhat of a different process. It isn't exclusively based on the decomposition process as much as it is on the characteristics of the worms and what the worms do. Of note is that this is a mesophilic process. Obviously, if we had 131 to 150 degrees gross, we'd have boiled worms. So this is a more in the middle of the temperature spectrum, and you are at that stage, you're farming the worms as much as you're working. Like in our situation, we are farming microbes. So you're basically a worm farmer, and your focus is on the health of those worms. Another thing that's really important to point out is that worm castings are not the same thing as vermicompost. So that's a common misconception. Worm castings are just worm poop. And vermicompost is what happens as a result of the entirety of the process.
Hi, little baby.
Hello, this is very quick because I'm getting ready to go to work and I'm submitting.
Hey, Tara, could you mute, please?
Okay.
But I'm submitting like.
You
Tara?
can mute her, Jen
sorry.
or Katie.
Well, Katie's not a host, but
Oh, right.
I think she took care of it. Okay, cool. All right, so the next few slides are they're very content dense. I'm not going to read all of the specifics. They're just here for your reference, but this is just to keep into our heads again, what is the systemic way of thinking about this entire process? Smell is really important. We talked about other things like lab tests, microscopy, but just really what do you, as your body in the field, what are you observing? If your smell is off, not when you just turn things, then it's usually off when you turn. But if you have a very strong bad smell, or if it smells like urine, a very strong ammonia smell, something's not quite right. We need to talk about that. Your temperature should be 131 to 160 is technically getting too high. 155 is when you want to really start saying, hey, you know, what's going on in the primary phases, secondary phases we talked about. And one thing we didn't really get into too much is that it is finished, which means the decomposition process is basically settled out. Then your temperatures are going to be ambient. So you can see what the air temperature is, and you can see what the inside of your pile is. And if it's the same, then your compost has finished. And then it can go into a curing phase. And that's when it rests for a little bit. You don't have to do that, but it's helpful to do sometimes. And that's when you really allow these higher level microbes to build up and do their thing. One thing I want to mention about temperature is if you do notice inconsistencies throughout your pile, I definitely am experiencing this myself. Maybe you have super cold at the bottom, super hot in the middle, then your pile probably needs to be mixed. Those temperatures should be somewhat homogenized. Visual observations, yeah, Knut, fire away.
Oh yeah, what kind of thermometer do you use? Or I mean, just any, you know, body thermometer you stick it in, or not one you use nowadays for shooting that infrared?
No, John, do you want to speak to the thermometer and maybe a little bit about technique too, like temperature taking technique?
Yeah, there are really good composting thermometers on the market. They're made by a lot of companies, but we like Rio Temp, and they can come as long as 4 or 5 feet long if you have really big piles. And the sensor is at the very tip, just to realize. But a infrared thermometer won't work because it only registers the thermal energy of the surface, and you want to get inside the pile. So it's best to check the temperature throughout the pile. So your thermometer needs to be long enough to be able to do that.
And you shouldn't leave your thermometer in the pile. This is a really valuable tool, and also they make them with handles, so that especially if you get more sophisticated with your thermometers, you want to be very careful. It's an investment, it's a tool. So they make them with little handles too that you can, so you're not grabbing the thing. And we've left ours in our compost. We've trashed so many thermometers, but yeah, that is the most, besides our bodies, our thermometers are the most important tool that we have. Visual observations, we've talked about several of these, but you may see some insects during decomposition, secondary decomposition, but you should not be seeing flies and maggots, because that means that there's a lot of organic material still in there that should have been broken down during primary. It's also very common, our piles in secondary, actually we have these beautiful mushrooms. When it first happened, we were like, but we were pretty reassured. You might see some of the fungal growth, the white, not the white that we were talking about, that means your piles are too hot. But this can be the white threads of fungal activity, which is again, pretty magic. The squeeze test we've talked about, super important. You want to squeeze it. It should be not dripping out of your hand. It shouldn't crumble, but have a nice tight, and it can tend to glisten when you look at it. Also pile structure. When you use your thermometer, if you have to jam it in, then you've probably got pockets that are too dense. Your thermometer should slide in pretty easily. The sides of the pile should hold up under, should hold up. And your pile's not gonna look like that. It's gonna look like this. They shouldn't collapse. So basically looking at your pile structure. Vocabulary word for testing, we haven't mentioned this one yet, but you can do a bioassay test. One compost operator that I went through a training with doesn't do any testing. All he does is he puts what he thinks is his finished compost into a Ziploc bag, seals it, puts it on the shelf for a few days. When he opens it, it should still smell like compost. If it smells rotten, then he hasn't achieved what he thought he would. And you can also do, you can put seeds into your compost and sprout them and make sure that they sprout, knowing that you have viable seed. There have been, Vermont Compost had a very unfortunate situation where they ended up with some pesticides, persistent pesticides, that did some pretty big damage. So bioassay tests are another opportunity. We talked about lab tests and again, microscopy, we just can't say enough about that.
And can I just jump in real quick
Yeah,
with the testing? As we've done more of the microscopy testing and work with farmers who are using other testing, it's really clear that the more information you have, the better. No one test gives you, the kind of observational test that Jen just said, no one of those tests gives you the whole picture. And testing alone also doesn't necessarily give you all the information you need. The observations as you've moved through the composting process is important to kind of track. So you may end up with really good looking, good smelling, even good looking compost under the microscope, but it could still be full of pathogens and weed seeds if it hasn't hit those temperatures. And we can't tell that under the microscope. So more and more we're realizing that as many kind of tests or observations as you can do is important, and no one thing will give you will give you the whole picture.
Perfect. Awesome. This is a picture of a sample that was sent away to a lab. The first time we tested, I had to call John Culpepper and like help to interpret the results. But once you get familiar with what it is that you're looking at, then it just jumps at you and you know exactly what you're looking for. So if you do decide to test anything, and again, you can test your feedstock too. It doesn't have to be that you're testing your finished compost. It's you can test any number of things to understand the characteristics based on these bulk density, total solids, moisture content, etc. We chose to sample our compost in the beginning. It is not cheap, but it was incredibly valuable for us to get a baseline. It's something you can do in batches too. If you know you have a batch, nothing changes, but the information that you get is incredibly valuable. So if you do decide to do some testing, let us know and we will help you walk through some of those results. So just some troubleshooting. Again, information dense, so not needing to read all this stuff to you. This is a list of best practices. So this is something to keep in mind so that you don't have to get into those troubled situations. This is not exhaustive. There are 1,000 different ways that you can maximize the composting process. But the point is that if you develop a set of practices that work best for all of your factors, your location, who do you have to be able to be doing the work, there are steps that you can take so that you don't find yourself into some bad situations. This is a table that I put together that it's just some general guidelines. Again, none of this is ever set in stone, but if you get to the point where something isn't quite right, your temperatures aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, and you notice that there's a smell, these are just some general guidelines to help you decide. So on the left, it's like, this is what you're seeing. Okay, my pile is horrible. It smells like cat pissed all over my backyard. Your temperatures are way over 155. So here are some things that you can do to address some of those issues as they emerge. And again, if you get to the point where you are looking at this and it's like, oh, this is too confusing, that's what Katie, John, and I are here to help you work through some of these challenges on your own. This is the other, yeah, Sarah, yes.
So sorry, this is not in
Nope.
line with the slide, but I actually have to leave for my next appointment. But I wanted to ask earlier, about the horse manure, and I've heard about adding manures in general. Are you adding that for nutrient or to put in microbes to your pile?
All of the above, but let me just
Okay.
quickly say horse manure is very scary because there are some persistent pesticides that go through horses.
Okay.
If you are not 1000% confident of their feed, those pesticides actually persist through the animal and into their manure and can contaminate a pile. So I just want to point that out. But my compost business doesn't choose to use animal manure because it's just too scary for us and we don't need it. So John, do you want to speak to her question about why you would add horse manure? Like what would that add to your pile microbially versus the nutritional?
Yeah, you're not adding full set of microbes, but Sarah, many people really value horse manure, partially broken down or fully broken down. It's a common thing that people add to their gardens. So in most cases, very safe, but you're adding horse manure to the compost pile to add organic material for the microbes to feed on. And if it's not really dry, adding it for the moisture as well. And the horse manure with a little bit of shavings or a little bit of bedding is automatically at about a 30-to-1 ratio. So you can compost what comes out of your stalls without adding anything else, just maintain the moisture content and watch the temperature.
Okay, thank you so much.
No, thank you. And Sarah, thanks for joining us. These are awesome questions. I can't see, it says 2 participants raised hand. I'm not sure if there's somebody else I can't see on my screen. Knut, yes.
Yes, I have a follow-up question to that horse manure. What about alpaca manure?
What about it?
I mean, is that any different? You mentioned,
Alpaca manure is structurally very different from horse manure, but as long as the feed going into the alpaca, as long as you're confident that you don't have persistent herbicides in the feed, then alpaca manure is perfectly fine to compost, makes beautiful compost. And that is true with all manures. We don't tend to like to put our human manure in for obvious reasons. There's a yuck factor. There's also a pathogenic factor, but it can be composted safely by the right facility and by the right operator and turned into perfectly fine compost.
So if I have alpaca manure, should I mix it into the garden bed or should I mix it into my compost pile?
Yeah, you really want to compost any manures, in fact, any organic material first before adding it to the garden. Now, you don't have to. A lot of people will add, horse manure directly to their garden. But by going through the composting process, you're building those sets of microbes that do all that good work that we talked about earlier. So I would recommend that all organic material be composted before adding to the garden if you can.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Katie, are there any chat questions?
Nope.
Cool. Okay. So this is just a slide, hopefully a little bit of a review, but we simply cannot say and strongly enough how game-changing us acquiring a microscope and us having a John Culpepper who's going through some training to learn how to use that microscope. I cannot wait to get a microscope. I feel like I would probably spend all day looking at it. We just can't say strongly enough how important and possibly undervalued the microbiota is in this whole process. A lot of people just focus on the soil sample testing from like a lab perspective, but the biologically robust compost is really important. We are testing with some farms that have been organically farming and are incredibly well respected in their communities for having very viable organic farms for decades, and we've tested their soil and have found it to be mostly bacterial and not very diverse in what's in it. Other people, myself included, testing compost that looks beautiful and looks fantastic, but when we look under a microscope, it's tells a completely different story. So this is a really important step to take if you could do it yourself. It does require some training. If you would like to have Compost for Good help you analyze your soils or your compost, we also do this as part of a grant that we're working on and hope to be doing it well into the future. But you also, so you know that there are consultants out there that offer that same service for an incredibly pretty decent amount of money, but is really worth it. So some resources that we want to share with you, James McSweeney, we did say, we mentioned him before. This is his book. This is what my book looks like. I don't know if you can see it from the screen sharing, but it's very well loved book in my world. Very well loved human. James is the godfather of community scale composting. I don't know if he would claim that title, but I'm giving it to him. He also, Katie and I have gone through his course. I can't say enough about that. It's very accessible online. We have sponsored several scholarships. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please let us know. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance has a community composter coalition that also is amazing. They have a discussion group. I get probably 15 emails a day from that group, but I can't say strongly enough how much I learned from them. They have monthly webinars, tons of resources. They're a fantastic partner. New York State Organics Council. So this is the part where I'm gonna, Christine, I know if you're there, if you're still part of the call, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
I think she dropped out some time back.
Okay. So this is Christine Ellsworth, who is our partner in the New York State DEC and a staunch advocate for community composting, a part of the head of the New York State Organics Council, or just a part of it. I'm not, she's a huge part of it. But if anybody has questions about permitting registration, that entire process, please let us know. We will connect you to Christine. So just so you know, at certain levels of quantity of organics, you will need to be either permitted or registered with the DEC. It is not a terrible process, but we'd be happy to help you with it. The state also has an organization called the Center for Ecotechnology that we also partner with that is available to provide a broad range of support. I believe they're going to have a compost operator training coming up in the fall. So we're super excited about that. Recipe calculators we talked about, we will happily share them with you, but also provide some training and some support if you are wanting to go through that. And Compost for Good, among multiple resources, including case studies and videos, business plans, we do have a composter operating manual and design document that are free. Biocycle magazine, hyperlinked here, is our Bible. John is constantly sending us, I read this great story from Biocycle, and we've been featured in it as well. And the second to the last thing I'll leave you with is that our next workshop is in person at the Witten family farm in Winthrop to tour their beautiful aerated static pile and compost building that they timber frame built. It is June 12th, 10 to 12. If you are interested, please email me and I will put you in our list of people that will be participating. And I will end with our contact slide.
And in person only, correct, Jen?
That is correct. Yeah, there's no other option for us. Yes, that is correct. So thanks for listening. That's a lot of information to process. We are here to support you if you have questions or follow up, but are there any other comments, questions, anything in the chat, Katie? Oh, is Katie still there?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, there's nothing in the chat except for Ermin just said harvesting microbes from the woods. Speak to that. Question mark.
Yeah, happy to do that. And I'll start by saying this, Canute, if you're still there, thanks for joining us. I'll start by saying that the most productive soils on the planet are old growth forest and high mountain meadows. And nobody's up there fertilizing these old growth forests. This is all a natural cycling process because they tend to foster the right kind of microbial communities. In old growth forests, it's primarily high fungal communities, a lot of different kind of fungi. So if you have access to woods, and if those trees in that wood, in those woods are old, and there hasn't been a lot of disturbance, and if you're allowed to, grabbing a handful of soil from that area and adding that to your compost can inoculate your compost with additional microbes that are suited to your particular location. So this is a, when and where you're allowed to, this is a great way to inoculate your compost systems. Now, ideally, you would analyze the handful of soil that you take under a microscope to make sure, to verify that you're actually adding additional microbial life. But by and large, if it's an old forest, you've got really good things in that soil that you might want to add to your compost system.
And he clarified during secondary. Ermin, I'm assuming your mic is still not working. If that's not true, feel free to unmute yourself. He added during secondary phase, correct?
Yes, that's correct, because the many of those microbes don't thrive at very high thermophilic temperatures. So yes, during the secondary phase, when you're down closer to 90 degrees, 80 degrees, or closer to ambient temperature, that's the time to add that handful in half a bucket load, whatever, and mix that thoroughly and make sure the pile is hydrated. That's the time to add it, yes.
Great, those are awesome questions. And John, do I have this accurately understood that it seems like I heard that most soils are actually okay in terms of like mineral content and like what's in them, but it's more a matter of the microbial life that's missing.
Yeah, so
is that accurate?
yeah, soils all over the world have enough plant nutrients to grow crops for hundreds and hundreds of years. But those plant nutrients are unavailable either because of pH issues, because of compaction issues, because there's not enough nutrient cycling happening in the soil. But you can improve any soil type, almost any soil type, by the addition of really robust, biologically robust compost. There are very few situations where compost isn't a great addition to soils.
That's awesome. Thank you. That was surprising for me to hear. Ermin said something earlier. I'm interested in learning more about the InVessel system for a composting project at an urban farm, and he shared his email. So yes, we can certainly reach out to you, or feel free to contact us as well, and we're more than happy to chat with you about that.
And I would recommend starting with our website, because the design document and the operating manual are free to download. But if you need additional help, we are more than happy to have a conversation with you.
Excellent. And he said, "Thank you, will do!" Exclamation point. Great. I am not seeing anything else in the chat. Any other comments, questions, follow-ups from folks on the call? Okay. Thanks for staying with us. That was a lot. Folks who are listening in through our recording, please reach out anytime with questions, follow up to set up a site visit, especially if you're a farmer, especially if you're in the North Country. If you are out of the area, still happy to hop on a call with you. Katie or John, any last minute thoughts, questions, comments? Otherwise, thanks to everybody. And
yeah, a big thank you from me and all of us at Compost for Good for taking the time. I know all of you are busy people, and we very much appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you from me too.
great. Thanks, everybody. Katie and John, do you want to stay on for just a sec?
Sure.
Okay. There's one. Okay.